Yeah, hello everybody. Today we invited Graham Prescott from the University of Bern. Maybe a few words on his CV. He studied in Cambridge and Oxford and made his PhD in Cambridge. He studied the effects of land use change, landscape configuration and management practices on biodiversity in tropical landscapes. That was mainly in Malaysia and palm oil plantations. He finished in 2015 and then worked for 3 years as a research fellow in Singapore at the National University. And since 2019, he's based in Bern, living in Basel, at the University of Bern, and works in the mountain biodiversity and the Sustainable Development Goals project together with Markus Fischer and others. So then we are curious about your talk.
Great. So let me, do I need to share my screen? Okay. Great. Thank you, Stefan, for the really nice introduction. And so, yeah, are we talking to you today about mountain biodiversity for sustainable development? And as Stefan mentioned, I started with a background more in doing hands-on biodiversity surveys of ants and birds and palm oil landscapes. And I've since been, as my career has been moving on, I've been looking more at how people perceive nature, how people perceive biodiversity, and how people perceive the benefit of biodiversity for people and their livelihoods, and how that's integrated into landscapes. So I'm going to start with the grand challenges. Why are we doing this? I mean, this is all very familiar to you, but humans are dramatically changing both the Earth's climate, but also the composition of the biosphere in Václav Smil's nice terminology. And I always like to share this XKCD representation of what Václav Smil showed, which is that really humans, a huge predominance of animal biomass is now comprised of either humans or their commensal species. But despite this total transformation of the biosphere, we still have a lot of social issues, namely multidimensional poverty, especially concentrated in areas of the global south. And so what I'll tell you today is more focus is with a mountain focus, because I'm working on a mountain biodiversity project, and we're based in Switzerland, which has lovely mountains. And beyond the personal interest, mountains are globally important. They're centers of biodiversity. Depending on what definition of mountains you use, perhaps about 500 million people live in the world's mountains, and they cover about 12% of the world's land surface outside of Antarctica. Mountain ecosystems are often remote, quite fragile, and quite vulnerable to global change. And the same that's true not only for the biological communities, but also for cultural and social ecological systems, such as this remote community in the Muktinath region of Nepal. Two of the guiding frameworks that we use for this research are the IPBES conceptual framework, which has been used in global policy discourse, so separating it into different drivers of change, nature itself, nature's contributions to people, which overlaps with the concept of ecosystem services, and that ultimately affects human well-being or supports a good quality of life for everyone. The other major policy discourse we engage with is policy framework are the Sustainable Development Goals. So this was launched in 2015, and there's an ambitious range of targets that all the world's countries have agreed to try and reach by 2030. And one of them is, a key component is SDG 15, which is to conserve life on land. And there's even a specific mountain biodiversity one. So by 2030, ensure that all mountain ecosystems are conserved. And so, it's ambitious, but it clearly recognized as important. So a lot of conceptual so review by Blecharska and colleagues has argued that biodiversity is actually really fundamental to achieving the other goals. And this would be going back to the IPBES component conceptual framework. This would be, for example, through biodiversity as it operates through providing nature's contributions to people or ecosystem services, in turn supports all the other goals to, for example, be resilient against the actions of climate change, to eliminate poverty by providing livelihoods, to support agriculture and support health, and so on. However, the scale of interactions might be very different. So for example, conserving mountains. So here we have an opinion piece I worked on, led by my colleague Daphne Payne. And if we look here, if the inner ring might be how the Sustainable Development Goals are felt within a mountain community, the outer ring maybe how they're felt at a global community. So mountain biodiversity might be really important at a local scale for providing livelihoods and maybe less important at the global scale. But at a global scale, conserving mountain biodiversity might be at further geographical scales, conserving mountain biodiversity might have more important downstream effects on, for example, water provision, which is a way of introducing the fact that you need to operate at different scales. So clearly the world is interconnected. So you need the big picture. However, policy making, which the actual policy world typically happens at the national scale. So most actions that affect conservation and development are taken by national governments, sometimes by subnational governments. But then where people and nature interact is actually at a local and idiosyncratic scale. So in the projects I'm working on, we're always trying to think about do operate at these different scales. And then how do you approach these? So obviously having a high resolution data on what's happening in all facets of well-being and biodiversity in all of the world's mountains is just not feasible. So what we try to do, and what I'll present a bit here, is to use a combination of 3 different approaches. So using available databases, which the benefit is that, well, they're already there. Unfortunately, they're not always at the temporal and spatial scale that you want. We can also interview experts, which is good. It's a bit more feasible than going out and collecting biodiversity and ecosystem service data. But of course, you have to be quite careful about who qualifies as an expert, how you ask them, and how you validate their results. Or you can go collect new field data, which is more time and resource intensive. And that's what you would ideally do, but often you don't have the time to do it. So I'm going to use a combination of all 3 approaches, and this is all work in progress. But we're talking about, I'm going to present to you from one project I'm working on, which is specifically focused on Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanzania. So looking at how to conserve and sustainably use biodiversity. And also a project that I'm managing and coordinating here at the University of Bern, which is a research for development project looking at mountain biodiversity and sustainable development goals. Within that I'm going to present an expert survey and workshop from Kilimanjaro, and then from the mountain biodiversity and sustainable development goals, I'm going to talk about a household questionnaire in the Uluguru Mountains of Tanzania, looking at how people perceive the influence of nature on reaching the sustainable development goals, and also on some work we've done on analyzing trends in sustainable development goal indicators at the national level and subnational level in Nepal. So I'm going to start with Kilimanjaro, just to show you where we are. So we're right here near the Tanzania-Kenyan border. It's probably the most iconic mountain in Africa. And yeah, what we've done is there was a workshop 3 years ago now to assemble local knowledge. So And what they did is they selected experts from different stakeholders. So, for example, representatives of local communities who are farmers on the slopes of Mount Kilimanjaro, people from important sectors, so for instance, tourism, and also people who work for conservation NGOs and researchers based in the information. And yeah, so we have, these are the 5 groups. So we have community, conservation, research, resources, and other sectors, including tourism's. And we had a participatory workshop where we asked people to assess the condition of the habitats on Mount Kilimanjaro and the ecosystem services provided, and to ask people as well what they thought were the key drivers of change in these ecosystems. And so, yeah, overall, we have a pretty bleak perspective, that looking at every ecosystem, you know, from the alpine sector above the tree line, the forest, the agroforestry zones, the croplands at the bottom of the slopes, the freshwater ecosystems, and the grassland savanna ecosystems. Most respondents reported that the area and condition were declining, and I mean, this is very coarse taxonomic resolution, but just to get a general picture of, you know, what they thought was happening to the avifauna, the mammalian fauna, and trees on Mount Kilimanjaro, generally the perception was pretty negative. When we asked about the trends in nature's contributions to people, ecosystem services, again, looking at the last 10 years, pretty much everything has been negative except for water and livelihoods. And then if you ask people to project what will happen in the next 10 years, everyone is almost pretty unanimous pessimism, that most people predict that the ecosystem services provided by the biodiversity and ecosystems of Mount Kilimanjaro will decline. So I'm going to show you a few of these graphs, which are Sankey figures. And the way to interpret these is these show co-occurrences. So for example, this is if an expert from the community group, we asked everyone, what are the important ecosystem services that are provided and where do they come from? So, and the width is proportional to the number of responses. So each strand would be, for instance, top strand would be someone from the community group said that water was an important ecosystem service and that it came from the forest. And that forest was the primary one providing that service. So yeah, it's general perspective, the most important ecosystem services that people think are provided are water and livelihoods, and forest and freshwater ecosystems are considered the most important habitats there. So when we asked people why those ecosystem services were declining. And again, same thing. So the main trends going on for perceived drivers. So people think that effectively water is decreasing because of population increase and resource competition. So it's very high birth rates. And there's just, as there are more people, there's more pressure on the land, more pressure on the water. And you know, and consequently, there's also deforestation and forest degradation. Of course, climate change is having an impact, and we've already seen kind of unusual forest fires on Kilimanjaro over the last year. And I thought this was interesting because looking back, we had some people said that actually water and livelihoods were perhaps the positive stories for the last 10 years. And so to the extent that water and livelihoods had increased, people attributed to improved education and awareness and improved infrastructure and irrigation. And then looking back at the overall picture of why habitats are changing, people fundamentally cite demographic issues as the underlying causes. And so it's really demographic pressures are driving land use change. And this is leading to decreases in forest and freshwater ecosystems. And then this was So what was interesting is we also asked people, well, what actions would you like to take to prevent these? And so land and water management, which, I mean, this is a very broad categorization, but effectively people saying we need stricter zoning for land and water resources. But education and awareness and better law enforcement and economic incentives for conservation were all popular answers as well. So the conclusion of this first subsection is that Kilimanjaro's biomes and biodiversities are gravely endangered, along with the ecosystem services they provide. So, and this is clearly, millions of people live in and around Mount Kilimanjaro. So this is really important for people's livelihoods, as well as for the unique biodiversity hosted on Mount Kilimanjaro. What we found interesting is that stakeholder groups, we did a permutational, I don't have a slide on this, but we did a permutational analysis of variance to see if there was any difference in the overall suite of responses given by different groups. And we found that actually there's no significant difference. So it's an interesting, it was methodologically, it was kind of interesting that you might have thought that if you have people from community representatives and also academic researchers, we wondered would they have very different pictures as to what was going on in the mountain, but there wasn't. And some of the trends we're seeing here matches quite nicely with work by, for example, also other colleagues of collaborations with Marcus Fisher. So a paper by Peters et al. In 2019 published in Nature. Also found widespread decline in biodiversity and ecosystem services in Kilimanjaro. So, so this is some validation that this expert workshop approach can be used in situations where it might not be feasible to do extensive multi-taxa biodiversity surveys. So that was section 1 of 3. So second section, we're now looking at back to mountain biodiversity and sustainable development goals. So the goal of this project is to identify synergies and trade-offs between biodiversity conservation and other development goals with a view of finding pathways for sustainable development that are centered around conservation. So we're working at sort of global, national, and subnational scales. So this is based, of course, on partnerships with ECMOD in Nepal, the Sequoia University of Agriculture in Tanzania, and Compass in Bolivia. And so we're doing some work at national scales, subnational scales, and global. Today I'm going to be presenting work at the subnational scale in Tanzania and the national scale in Nepal. And I don't know how familiar this is, but I'll give a brief overview in that we have this coming back to our 17 sustainable development goals. These are broken up into 169 specific targets, of which conserving mountain biodiversity is one of them. And we have this kind of interesting dilemma where the whole framing of the sustainable development goals is this unified framework, is that if you make progress towards one of them, you're automatically going to make progress to the other. But if you look at the goals, there are clearly issues with this. So for example, there's promoting, so one of the sub goals for SDG 11 for SDG 9 for industry is to have 8% GDP growth in developing and least developed countries. But obviously there's so if you're promoting kind of huge economic growth in all developing countries, then it's very hard to do that without also harming biodiversity or threatening progress on resilience to climate change. And so in practice, each goal might help or hinder the achievement of another goal. So what we often do in these kind of studies is say, for a set, you take a pair of goals and you say, right, is this helping this? So for example, if you build a road, it's easier to send people to school. So maybe road construction will reinforce literacy programs, but road construction might limit options for conservation as well. So you get a lot of studies where, so some studies have taken the approach of scoring pairwise goals through the literatures. This is from Weitz et al. In 2018. And some have also taken the approach of looking at correlations between indicators of sustainable development goals, which is what I'll present later today. Sorry, what I'll present later, but what I'll start with is looking at how we're quite curious to see how individual people at a household level perceive the sustainable development goals. So I think as biodiversity, I come from a biodiversity science background, so I've quite clear definitions of biodiversity and very much think about the whole range of taxonomy. But then actually when in practice, when you ask people, what does nature mean to you? People are not, and we're talking, let's say, if you're a coffee or strawberry farmer in the Uluguru Mountains, you're going to have a very different conception of what nature is and how it benefits you. So this was, so we did this more as I think this almost as a random sweep to say, really to try and say without biasing people, to say, how does this particular facet of nature influence your life? Really say, what does nature mean to you and how do you think it affects your life? And this might get different, this might give you quite different results to if you go do a biodiversity survey and measure flows of ecosystem services. But I think this is important because it gives you a starting point to how people, because conservation needs to be locally supported and locally popular, and it needs to achieve meaningful goals for people's lives. So this is really a starting point to say, how do people perceive nature as it applies to sustainable development? So this is work in progress. This is the first batch of results from the Uluguru Mountains. And yeah, so we asked whether they'd met the SDG goals and how they perceive trade-offs in nature. This is fieldwork led by Adili Bugingo, a PhD student at Sokoine. So these are 150 respondents, a bit of a male bias, but mostly, most of the people have a sort of primary school level education or no formal education at all. And yeah, so this is really just first pass at analyzing the data, which have just come in 2 weeks ago. But yeah, mostly we can see that people have, and this is applying a threshold to whether sustainable development goals are met or not. They're very clear targets about, is asking, so do you have enough income to support your household? Do you feel like have you ever been food insecure in the last 12 months? You had good health. So people's perceptions are that their water and health needs are universally met, work and income mixed, but no one has electricity, for example. And people are quite affected by landslides and floods. So I think mostly, so no change at all in energy. And we asked, how have these changed in the last 5 years? So as your income improved, as your food security improved, health improved, and so on. And so yeah, mostly positive changes apart from energy. And then this is the more interesting part of saying, really, okay, so how do people perceive the nature as supporting the sustainable development goals? And broadly, basically pretty universally positive, apart from food security. And so the negative answers here are due to wild animals and crop pests eating crops and threatening it. So overall, people are pretty positive about nature. However, when you look more closely, so this is something we're doing follow-up interviews with now, but when you look more closely at some of the sub-answers, how people define nature is really also using a broad definition, including the crops that they grow. So when you look closely at the answers, they say, for example, nature has a positive impact on education. And the way it does that is because nature includes the crops that you grow, and by selling the crops, you get money to send your children to school. So broadly, people have a very, or these respondents have a highlighting the benefits of material and regulating NCPs, so especially effectively crops and the income gained from them. And so this is the idea, is to do this, repeat this in Nepal and Bolivia and different sites in Tanzania as well. Obviously, the field work was heavily delayed by COVID, and it's only been possible in Tanzania, which has taken the view that COVID doesn't exist in the country. But we'll now that things are opening up and there's more vaccination, we should be able to apply this. We've started in Bolivia, and we should be able to do this in Nepal as well. Although they're having a big spike in COVID infections at the moment, so that's currently on hold. And then sticking with Nepal, the last of 3 sections that I'm going to present to you today is looking at, is saying what we can discern from databases of sustainable development goal indicators. So yeah, Nepal's a beautiful mountainous, mostly mountainous landlocked country. And it's kind of interesting. You can sort of think of it as having 3 belts. So it's got a mountain belt, a hill belt, and a lowland belt called the Terai, which is on the border of India. And here you can also see where forest cover is concentrated. So darker colors are more heavily forested areas. So concentrations here around Chitwan National Park, and especially in the west and parts of the mountains in the east. And so what we did here is this work led by Biraj Adhikari, a PhD student at the University of Bern. And so we took all these databases, so from the national censuses, and the Nepal land cover map, as well as global databases on forest cover and SDG indicators, to get pairwise correlations of between sustainable development indicators at both spatial and temporal scales. So today I'm going to concentrate on the temporal scale. So this is a time series of SDG indicators at the country level. And you can see, for instance, in the biodiversity related ones, since 2000, primary forest cover has been declining. These are standardized changes. So forest cover has been declining, but the proportion of key biodiversity areas in freshwater and mountain ecosystems has been increasing, and the amount of aid for biodiversity has also been increasing. This is a complicated diagram, which I will simplify later, but this is what happens when you create a network of the sustainome, which, to use Luceau and Mancini's terminology. So the sustainome is this idea of, in the same way that if you might look at gene expression networks and have a genome, you could have an interaction, a network of interactions between sustainable development goals. So this is looking at all the pairwise correlations, all their links to each other. The sort of yellow colors are negative correlations, and the blue colors are positive correlations. And then looking at, so this is trying to understand which, and using network metrics like eigenvalue, you can measure the influence of the different goals on each other. So we're looking at which of the overall sustainable development goals seem to have the biggest influence on the network. So life on land ranks 5th, and responsible consumption and production, water, and reducing inequalities come out as the most important or influential networks. And the purpose of these, and it's done in other sustainable development studies as well, is really to say, well, if you have limited resources and you can't apply them in all goals, which ones should you prioritize first, or which ones are potentially going to be the most important? And then we can also, we also use this to look a bit more closely at which sustainable development goals are interacting, trading off positively and negatively with forest cover and other metrics. And what we find is that forest cover is interacting pretty negatively with access to energy, education, health, food, and income. Which is to say that as forest cover has been, where forest cover has been going down, these have all been getting better. And yeah, so, and what it points to is that, you know, and again, these are really correlational. So they're not, you know, a flaw of these database analyses is that they don't show a causal link. There are a lot of things going on, and it's really, we don't have enough data points to do a structural equation model or to really break it down. But they do give us, by looking at which ones seem to be most influential, it gives us, I see this as a preliminary screening to say which interactions would be interesting to then look at more detail in using interviews, literature analysis, and fieldwork. And I don't have the slides here, but there's some trends looking spatially, which suggests that actually the link between, for instance, the negative correlation between energy access and forest is only true in mountains. So in mountains, there's a negative interaction between energy access and forest. So where there's been more deforestation, people have more energy access, but that's not true in the lowlands. And that would map onto trends that we observe in the mountains. People are primarily using fuel wood as their energy source, whereas in the lowlands, there have been more efforts to use, for instance, cow dung or biomass as energy sources. So what we see here is really a preliminary screening to identify which are the sort of negative things that need to be decoupled. So for instance, access to food doesn't need to be coupled to deforestation if you have a smart program of, for example, sustainable intensification coupled with habitat protection. So yeah, so this is really, so yeah, we found that across Nepal, forest cover is rapidly declining outside of protected areas. And it's negative. The key negative interactions are with access to food, energy, education, and healthcare. So this suggests a preliminary screening of ways in which we can look at, sort of a preliminary screening of what development goal interactions we need to focus on for future research and policy action. So overall, we know that mountain biodiversity is declining rapidly. And this is bad both for the intrinsic value of biodiversity, which is quite rare in mountains, and but also because people depend on mountain biodiversity and ecosystem services for their livelihoods. No one approach out of expert questionnaires, household questionnaires, or database analysis are perfect, but by trying to use a mix of approaches at a range of scales, we hope to start getting a bigger picture. This is very much work in progress, but it's been really nice to present some preliminary results to you. And thank you. Obviously, I'd like to thank all my collaborators in the 4 countries, so Tanzania, Bolivia, Nepal, and Switzerland, for making this work possible. And yeah, thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.